Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Sustainable Apparel Barometer-Practical Analysis of Key Issues and Innovation in Apparel Supply Chains. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion throughout the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. Now on to Lorraine with Textile Exchange. Lorraine?
Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. It's great to have this webinar today, just as we're easing into the holiday season. I hope everyone's doing well. This is an exciting topic. This is a report that came out in September, and a lot of things in motion, lots of good discussions, good follow-up discussion that we had at the conference. So looking forward to going over it a little bit more in detail, and Peter and I are going to have a little bit of a discussion about it. But first, I want to introduce Tanya Richard. She is the head of research and stakeholder engagement at the Innovation Forum, and she recently co-authored this report, the Sustainable Apparel Barometer, alongside Peter. And can you tell us a little bit, like, who is the Innovation Forum and what is your interest in textiles? Kind of what do you guys do?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Lorraine, and thanks to the whole team for setting this webinar up. I'm really looking forward to the discussions of the day. But yeah, a little bit of background about Innovation Forum for anyone who might have not heard of us before. We sort of sit in the middle of a lot of the sustainability world. For the last 8+ years, we've been mainly organizing conferences themed around various business sustainability issues. So really looking at across different industries. So in looking at sustainable landscapes, the plastics issue, human rights, food, and then also specifically in apparel, of course. So within the apparel space, we've been organizing a Sustainable Apparel and Textiles Conference also for around 8 years now, where we convene everyone around April time to discuss these issues. And then over the past few years, we've seen our impact sort of come into fruition, and we wanted to bring that even further. So we've been working a lot more in this research area and stakeholder engagement. So over the past year, Peter and I have been writing this Sustainable Apparel Barometer report, and he'll go into it in more detail, but sort of bringing our learnings from these conferences, from working in this industry for a while, from cross learnings across industries into a report. So it's great to be here, and thanks for having us, Lorraine.
Anya, it's great. And I think one of the interesting things about Innovation Forum is that you do work across different industries. So while we may get heads down, into what we're doing, Celeste, who works on our team, always says it's hard to read the label on the jar when you're inside the jar. So many times we get kind of locked into just the work we're doing, and we don't take that step back and look across the different industries. And maybe, we're all facing some of the same issues and challenges. So I think it's great work that the Innovation Forum is doing. And I think it's great that you're dedicated on this research and stakeholder engagement. I think more information, more briefing documentation is really helpful. And Peter, you've been a part of a couple of different reports now with the Innovation Forum. And just to introduce Peter, in addition to being an award-winning pie maker, he's a connoisseur of pies. And so it's a very exciting time as it's coming into Christmas seasons. He may have to do a little bit more baking, but his side job, in addition to baking, of course, is he's a political economist. And I find that very interesting, of the deep dive on how the political and societal issues impact economic development, environmental development. And so as part of this deeper dive on the Sustainable Apparel Barometer, I think it's really interesting to have that lens of the work that you do, Peter. So appreciate that perspective that you're bringing to the industry, and looking forward to a higher view of kind of what led you guys to getting into specifically the Sustainable Apparel Barometer, and we'll go from there.
Thanks very much indeed, Lorraine. And I don't think I've ever been introduced as a sort of a pie connoisseur before. So this is a unique first. And certainly my son thinks that by far the most important thing I do is cook his food. So anything I talk about today is very much second best as far as he's concerned. But anyway, looking forward to our chat in a moment. But everyone, very nice to be here, and good morning / afternoon / evening, delete as appropriate. Lorraine's asked me to just quickly run through where the Sustainable Apparel Barometer came from, which Textile Exchange kindly supported, and at least to go over some of the sort of headline findings as a sort of backdrop to a further discussion. Well, really where the barometer came from was kind of, there's always a lot of noise around the apparel sector. There's an awful lot of news articles about it, an awful lot of reports by the likes of World Economic Forum, that issues like Rana Plaza keep on getting pulled up. Obviously, at the moment, the issue with the Uyghurs in China is particularly timely. And obviously, the industry itself is responding significantly. But there's an awful lot of noise, an awful lot of heat, and an awful lot of light. But rather what we felt was, well, what actually is going on? If you dig away at all of these sort of headline issues, if you sort of dig into claims, for example, that fashion accounts for 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, or fashion is the world's biggest consumer of water, how far are these allegations true or not true? And how far are the responses that the industry is making appropriate, measured, consistent with what the challenge actually is? So what we felt we were trying to do is, I suppose, to cut through the kind of noise. There's an awful lot of noise and an awful lot of heat and light. But if we actually cut through all of that, what seemed to be the key questions to look at? And this is what we were trying to do with the Sustainable Apparel Barometer. First of all, are the allegations made about the sector actually correct? Or are they a certain amount of hyperbole on the part of politicians, campaign groups, and journalists? Secondly, again, there's an awful lot of stuff going on. Pretty much every brand company, every apparel company has some story to tell around sustainability. But of all those different approaches, which are the most effective at actually driving change? Sometimes you get an awful lot of stuff being done, which doesn't necessarily cut through to effectiveness. So what we wanted to try and do was to really, and this is the third point, try and look at, of all the things that firms could be doing, what does a credible business strategy and set of targets look like today? So really trying to focus on what does best practice look like? What can others build on that really does seem to work? But also behind that, oftentimes the focus in a lot of these sustainability areas is often onto the corporate sector, onto the private sector. But actually, at the end of the day, these are political issues to do with farmer welfare, with factory standards. All of these sorts of questions, in the final analysis, sit with the governments of the countries where those people sit. So what does a kind of policy framework look like that will actually enable the development on the part of the private sector of a functional approach, but also to look at, where is that overlap between the private sector on the one hand and public sector on the other? Now, obviously, it wasn't possible, in any sort of sensible world to look at the whole of the apparel sector. It's enormous. So what we did was look at 3 deep dives: cotton, viscose, and issues around standards and compliance, and really tried to say, well, and those were chosen really because of the interest of the organizations backing us, but also because they seem to have quite a lot to tell us. They're big in the news at the moment. So what lessons could we draw that maybe are generalizable to the apparel sector more generally? So drawing together overarching lessons. And I think what we found was that it is complicated. I suppose perhaps no surprise in that. But the point is that there are really, really good examples of good practice emerging, which can be built on. And we'll come to some of those, both in my comments now and then in the discussions with Rhea and Tanya later. So 5 kind of overarching conclusions. The first is to sort of misquote presidential elections: don't keep it simple. What we found in all 3 sectors, viscose, standards, and cotton, is there tends to be a desire to focus on the singular answer. So, for example, in cotton, everyone's talking about organic cotton, and in viscose, everyone's talking about reforestation, and in standards, everyone's talking about the need to reduce the number of standards, to try and come from, to reduce the plethora of standards to a smaller number of really good ones. But yeah, fine. But you get to a point where I think it's an Einstein quote. Simplify as far as possible, but not more so. And there's a point at which simplification is not helpful because it means one actually misses necessary complexity. So if one takes certification as an example, yes, absolutely, we want to get away from the situation where pretty much every man and his dog has their own standard. But at the same time, there are certain irreducible issues that need to be focused on. So for example, second versus third party audit and certification, both of which have a utility, but do different things. How do you then develop standards that account and feed into local norms? How a standard might work in, I know, Bangladesh might be very different from how it might work in Uganda. But also, how can change be achieved in complicated environments? That standards tend to be quite binary. You either make a standard or you don't. Whereas often you're dealing with, Bangladesh is a case in point, China will be another one. You're dealing with quite complicated multivariate geometry where an either-or standard isn't necessarily helpful. And so RAP, who was another organization that backed this study, they're talking about what they call symphonization, which is to try and say, well, let's have a number of different standards that work in different ways in different environments. So again, first thing is, don't focus on one simple answer. Unfortunately, it ain't as simple as that. Secondly, and I know that Lorraine and I are going to discuss this a bit more later on, there's a need to be realistic about that complexity. And I think sometimes there's in the report, we use the term dishonesty, which we were criticized for, but I think there's sometimes an illusion of an apparent attempt to pretend things aren't as complicated as they are. And, for example, if you go back to the original Cotton Declaration from 2017 under the Prince of Wales, companies promised that they were going to, by 2025, use 100% sustainable cotton. That's now been modified to 100% more sustainable cotton. Now, I know the point that Lorraine will quite rightly make is that sustainability is a journey, and that more sustainable is better than less sustainable. But the trouble is, Joe Public, the man in the street, they won't necessarily pick up on that subtlety. And it really, if claims of more sustainable are to have any credibility, then there has to be some credible measure, some credible set of metrics that say that we are more sustainable this year than last in the following ways. And we'll talk about that a bit more. I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. But it's not just the corporate sector that sometimes tries to oversimplify. The same is also true of NGOs. Now, again, calls for NGOs, trying to campaign on the basis of this is a complicated issue doesn't necessarily cut through with the sort of evening news contingent. So they want to try and have simple demands that they make of the corporates. So, for example, in viscose, you've got massive campaigns by NGOs that companies should reforest. So much so that more or less companies like April and APR in Sumatra will pretty much have to reforest the entirety of Indonesia if they're going to be able to sort of keep up with demands that the NGOs make of them. So the same is also true on the NGO side. There's a need to be realistic about what actually needs to happen, how that can happen, and critically, the time that that's going to take to occur. So this then moves us on to this question about, so how do you plot the journey to sustainability? There's a much, much stronger need to basically fess up to journalists, to politicians, to the general public that, look, this is bloody difficult. This is often comes to, unpicking, if you'll excuse the pun, when it comes to fabrics, the way in which a lot of business has been done for the last 2, 3, 4 decades. And there's a need to be completely frank about the fact that it is complicated. Historically, companies used to be able to get away with sort of saying, oh, well, the supply chain's complicated. You can't possibly trace, for example, the cotton supply chain all the way through. That's no longer an excuse. US Cotton Connect, the US Cotton Trust Protocol, they've both demonstrated that you can trace product all the way from the field it's grown in, all the way through to the garment that an individual wears. So saying it's complicated ain't helpful anymore. But what's needed is multivariate geometry, something that says, and this comes back to my point about more sustainable, is, well, okay, if you're saying more sustainable, what does that look like? And Textile Exchange and Cotton 2040 have been collaborating on the Delta framework, which I think is a tremendous step forward, because it says, look, this is complicated, and here's a set of issues that deal with, income of farmers, welfare of workers, emissions, deforestation associated with, and environmental damage associated with production of the input crops. It says, look, there's all these things on there, and fine, okay, fine, you haven't done anything on, I don't know, worker welfare this year, but you've done a hell of a lot on environmental protection, for example. It presents the thing as an holistic set of functions that need to move forward over time. And I think that presentation of complexity, that presentation of, look, this is complicated, but we can find a way of navigating through it, I think is absolutely what needs to be focused on. And initiatives like the Delta framework, I think, are phenomenal. And I know Lorraine is going to say a bit more about that in a moment. The fourth clear area is, and this is something that we bang on about a lot at Innovation Forum, is the need for collaboration. Tanya mentioned we did another report last year looking at smallholder farming. And part of the problem there, and the reason that smallholder supply chains remain unsustainable, is because the work that's done ends up being on a project basis. You know, Nestle has a coffee project, Mondelez has a coffee project, you know, another company has a coffee project. So it ends up being a lot of pinpricks at what actually is a systemic problem. And the same is also true in the apparel sector. A lot of the issues that we're dealing with are much bigger than even the biggest of fashion brands. You know, take things, for example, like the situation of the Uyghurs in China. You know, that's not something that the private sector can solve on its own or even at all. And certainly, and again, if you look at things like the power of the owners of mills in Bangladesh and the implication that that's had in terms of being able to replace the institution set up after Rana Plaza. You know, there are issues there where the corporate sector can't do it on its own. It needs to collaborate with government entities. And there are two aspects to that. As I said, as I've just been saying, there's a need for corporates and government to work much more closely together, you know, on issues like factory standards. You know, these are societal issues. The issues to do with worker welfare are often driven by societal norms rather than necessarily nasty, venal, horrible companies. And so it makes sense that they get dealt with in collaboration with government. But equally, there's a need for the sector itself to collaborate, that you know, the brands we see in high streets need to collaborate with their importers, need to collaborate with the factory, the factories they buy from. Unfortunately, at the moment, as the report says, that the evidence is that the industry does not really want to vertically integrate at the moment. There's a report in Draper magazine last year that said that, you know, more than 50% of fashion buyers said they didn't think that their company would invest in their supply chain, and simply that's got to change. There needs to be a greater degree of integration and collaboration between the sector as a vertically integrated whole. But I think, and this is the sort of the last area, is that there's a strong sense in many spaces that however good a lot of the models are, in many spaces sustainability remains tangential to many companies' mainstream corporate strategy. Companies like to talk a good talk on sustainability. This is not just the case in the apparel sector, but more broadly, they like to talk a good talk on sustainability. But when push comes to shove, it remains tangential to their core business strategy. And I think in the fabric sector, I think that the behavior of many companies during the COVID crisis has demonstrated the reality of this. These figures are slightly out of date because they date from July. But as at July 2021, a number of big brands had delivered to them goods from factories in China, India, Bangladesh, and they haven't paid for them. And that's brands like JCPenney, Walmart, Mothercare in Europe. So these are companies that have not paid poor workers, poor factories, $16 billion. And frankly, until things like that change, it's very hard to take those companies' sustainability strategies very seriously if you don't even get the basics right. Would any of us walk into a restaurant, have a jolly nice supper, and then walk out without paying? Of course we wouldn't. Why would that behavior be acceptable when it comes to not paying your supplier factories? Fast fashion, I mean, this is a well-established gripe, but if you're having fashion that turns over literally within 2 or 3 months, that leads to excessive fashion overtime in factories and huge amounts of discarded clothes just to pick up on 2 of the negative externalities. So until practices like this change, sustainability programs generally need to be taken with a considerable pinch of salt. Sustainability needs to become heart of the business decision-making processes. And there are absolutely plenty of examples. We were on a seminar last week, for example, with Patagonia, who do some amazing stuff. There are really, really good examples out there, but they remain, you know, exceptions rather than the general rule. So, just to conclude from my side, I mean, I'm old enough to have been in this game. My first gig in the sort of sustainability space was the sort of Euro 96 football kit hand stitched by 5-year-olds in Sialkot. So on the one hand, it's slightly depressing that we're still dealing with issues like environmental degradation, workers' rights in factories. But what's really clear from the research we put together for the Sustainable Apparel Barometer is that there are some really, really good examples of best practice, like, for example, the Delta framework, which can be built on. There is no excuse for companies to say, oh, it's too difficult, we can't do it. The examples, the best practice is out there. Companies just need to pick up on it. You know, hopefully, initiatives like, for example, the EU's move towards mandatory due diligence in supply chains will help, because it provides a bit of you know, further further pressure. But the key thing is that companies need to put sustainability at the core of strategy, which most don't do. And we can now talk about some of the best practice, but the best practice is there. Companies just need to use it. And hopefully you can see us now without the my slides.
That was a great overview, Peter, no doubt about it. And if you haven't read the report, make sure you do. It's a good read, and it's provocative. It makes you think about what we're doing. So I really appreciate the report, and it gives us an opportunity to say, here's what lessons learned. And I think one of the, you know, it's like, I'm glad we're finally saying it's complex. One of my favorite saying is that complex problems require multiple interventions. That's why you see so many different standards, or why you might see so many different initiatives. I think the collaboration message is key in that we need to move from these islands of good into a force for change. And it's great to see more collaboration, but I think there's some key messages in the report that definitely build on what do we need to do to deliver positive and proactive impacts and change. And I would just say also that the chat, we're not using the chat for questions. So if you do have questions or comments, put them in the Q&A component. But I'll turn it back over to Peter. You have a few questions, and I'm sure I'll have some for you, but you want to launch us in on our discussion.
Yeah, I think you and I had a long discussion about this when we were putting the thing together, this sustainable versus more sustainable. I mean, I'm a bit of an old cynic, and also having in a previous incarnation worked in PR, I'm aware of the fact that there's quite a lot of wool that can be pulled over the eyes of quite a lot of people. And I'm very skeptical of claims that companies make which aren't properly qualified, because I think it, again, call me a cynic, but my sense is that this is not designed to simplify, it's designed to confuse and obfuscate, which is why I was very skeptical about the shift from sustainable to more sustainable. But I know you take a different view than I do. So
absolutely, but that's
I'll
what
let you have your say.
about.
Exactly.
Steel sharpens steel, so one person sharpens another. So I love these kinds of conversations. And when it boils down to it, there is not a clear definition or meaning for what is sustainable. It's based upon principles of economic fairness, principles of environmental stewardship, principles of societal changes. So it's based upon principles, and there's not like a black and white list that you can kind of check off to say, this is sustainable, because there's always that room for continuous improvement. So we really feel like and believe that sustainability is a journey, and that it's about thresholds and taking progress. And how do you, with an industry that has so many challenges, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen bit by bit and step by step. And so it's exciting to see the number of initiatives that are taking those steps. Agreed that there needs to be some measurement in what does more sustainable look like. And so there's, like you say, the Delta framework is something that ISEAL has funded, which is the International Sustainability Standards, and Better Cotton Initiative's part of that. Cotton Connect's getting into that, as is US Cotton Trust Protocol. We're involved in that. Marine Stewardship Council, Forestry Stewardship Council. There's a lot of great standards that are involved in ISEAL, and see the need for identifying what are some of those thresholds? So the Delta framework is not only happening in cotton, but it's happening in coffee and some of the other work. And Delta framework, I'm just seeing in chat, it just, if you Google Delta framework, comes up with a site. It has the indicators, the thresholds, and things like biodiversity and soil health. So when it comes to those kinds of progress against, sustainability is like I said, based upon principles, and to try to take those principles and put them into something that can be quantified and measured, then that's kind of what we're doing. We are going to be piloting a fiber crops module this year, working across linen and cotton and hemp and other, any other fiber crop that goes into textiles, and using the Delta framework as those thresholds for measurement. So what are the best practices around building soil health? It may be cover crops, it may be crop rotation, the different things that affect soil health. And how do we quantify that? And that's a good first step. That's a good step. It's a solid step toward greenhouse gas reductions. And so measure that, quantify that, and say, okay, you as a farmer are establishing a more sustainable practice. There's, again, even when you get into advanced practices with organic and regenerative and biodynamic, there's always room for improvement. So we want to make sure that this more sustainable journey is in fact some way that we're allowed and able to provoke and help with government regulation and advocacy to make sure that we are on this journey of continuous improvement. So again, we have stopped using the word sustainable because we still use it in context. But as far as to say this product is sustainable, it might have used more sustainable practices. But when it comes to making a product claim, that's where using a standard is going to be where brands can benefit, and in having an ability to make a claim to consumers. So in the broad language, I don't feel like we're actually diluting anything. We're actually promoting and provoking and being that facilitator for continuous improvement.
You see, I think when it's expressed like that, I think that becomes completely exactly what's needed. You said at the top of the thing, I'm a political economist, and what that basically means is if you're going to try and get things to happen in location A or B, how do they actually work? How does the kind of social and political economic wiring diagram work? And as you say, that exactly what sustainability will look like in different locations in the apparel sector is going to be very, very different. And it's the ability to have that local appropriateness.
Not only local, but it's fiber by fiber. What does more sustainable look like in wool versus alpaca versus cotton versus, synthetics or anything? So it is about having that the ability, like you said, it's complex. You can't make one statement that applies to everything. And so it is about being able to take the nuances and integrate that both regionally and fiber by fiber for the textile industry.
I guess the interesting question that comes off the bottom end of that is, what does that imply, I guess, about the sort of focus on standards? I mean, if you look at, where standards came from, the idea was, if you go back, 20 years, well, we need something that says, be that fair trade, be that, Rainforest Alliance, whatever it happens to be, we need something that delineates the production. But maybe that's now too simplistic an approach. Maybe we do need something which is a more, three-dimensional, almost like a management standard approach, which is different. Instead of being able to sort of just have a flag on a garment or a thing that says this meets standard X or Y, you sort of in any one year you say, well, we've improved against these 3 of the 7 areas. Maybe it's something like that. What do you think about that as a movement?
It's all under discussion, certainly, about the difference in making a fiber claim versus a product claim, and how we move people along that continuum and educate consumers as a process. And so I know our Climate Plus focus is around biodiversity, water, and soil. So we're looking at how do we communicate that to consumers, like add that dimension and depth to the wool standard, for example. So how do we say that this standard is investing more in soil health, or click here to find out what this project is doing around regenerative agriculture. So that is how do we do more education and communication is is a challenge to keep the message as simple as possible, but understand the nuances and really educate consumers on that direction. We do have a question in the chat. It's to confirm what Peter said about the U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol. And I can certainly answer that. U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol is working with a group called Textile Genesis, and certainly with the bale tags and ID that are used by USDA. So the cotton grown in the United States can certainly be traced back to the bale and back to the farm. So yes, the U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol does have the capacity and capabilities of doing that. Peter,
And
anything you want to add?
Yeah, and Cotton Connect is able to do that
Yes.
in its work as well.
Also,
I mean, in both of those cases, they sort of knocked on the head that sort of, oh, it's far too complicated thing.
indeed.
I mean, yes, they've had to put in place some sort of pretty, clever stuff to make it work. But yes, you can now trace all the way back from a bale all the way back to the field it came from.
Good. I'm just going to be monitoring the Q&A as we go
I've
through.
got mine open there, so if anyone wonders why I'm looking at the other screen, that's
Multitasking at work.
One question I'd like to pick up with you, Rhea, is this question of trying to get vertical integration in the industry.
Mhm.
I mean, we can perhaps come to the governmental thing later, which has its own complexities. But, I was struck during the research for this, how almost resistant to collaboration some in the sector seem to be. Yes, it is very disaggregated in the sense that you've got, at one end, you've got, big brands, you be those retailers or be those, sort of consumer facing brands. And that often when you're dealing with the manufacturing end, I mean, certainly Bangladesh, which is where I know well, and China, I suppose, they're relatively small manufacturing units. So there maybe is a sort of a disconnect, but I was struck at how almost visceral the no, we don't want to collaborate was from the kind of, downstream of the industry. So I'd be interested in your comment on whether you think that's the case, and if it is, what we might be able to do about it. Because obviously that kind of sharing the equity, sharing the challenge is obviously key to making this change, making this different.
You mentioned that, and it's actually, I think it's a symptom of a bigger problem. So I think we need to look at the root cause of maybe why that is the case. And I personally think, and we were gathering more information on it, we've really got to shift from the price paradigm to a value paradigm. And, where we're willing to pay for the intrinsic value, for example, of that cotton is grown. I can't grow organic cotton on a maybe. We've got a number of brands that want to do organic cotton at price parity. Well, we got to remember that price parity has brought the pollution and the poverty and the problems. To think, it's the Einstein quote, to think that you're going to change something, in the same paradigm that's there is insanity. So it really is moving out of that price paradigm where price is the only factor. So when you start paying a fair price to that cut and sew, to that fabric weaver, to that, spinner, to the gin, to the farmer, it changes the whole equation. And so I don't know that vertical integration in a business sense is what really needs to happen. I think there's places where that's happening, where there's good partnerships happening. But I think ultimately we've got to have a massive paradigm shift to make this happen. All of our brands that we did a survey to said they would love to adopt preferred fibers, but they can't pay a penny more. Well, then you're not going to do preferred fibers. You need to rethink your business model. You're going to have to really look at what does it look like to take that down the path of shifting that, of conveying that value to consumers, looking at the business model, how that works. I think another interesting factor, there's a Rose, maybe you can put this report in the box as well. It is the friction point report that the climate board just did. And it really has some nice practical action items of like what to do, what happens when into that margin that the brands are so sensitive about. What if there's a carbon component or a biodiversity component that comes in there and helps add up and make all those numbers? When do the EP&L numbers, the environmental profit and loss numbers, go from just a number at the bottom of the page to a mandatory requirement that not only do you have to have a positive P&L, you have to have a positive EP&L and a social one as well. So I think looking at, more regulation is coming, regulation to protect people and planet. Brands are committing to huge targets, by 2030 on science-based targets and carbon neutral and net zero. There's a lot of commitments being out there. It's like, so how are you going to do it? if preferred fibers for us, we're in tier 4, is part of the solution, then you're going to have to change the business paradigm to that. So vertical might be one of the words, but I think the value paradigm is really where we've got to head.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that actually, and in doing so, looping back on Chris Broadbent's question about the Delta framework. And I think that you're absolutely right. There needs to be a complete shift in the paradigm of from price to value, and people have got to get away from the idea that you can have three t-shirts for $10, and that somehow those are going to be sustainably sustainable. I mean, it always horrifies me when I get things from the people I buy my shirts from saying half price. It's like, well, okay, very well, but I quite like having half price shirts, but at whose expense is that half price? And I think part of the challenge has been that it's almost as if, and this isn't just the case in the apparel sector, I think it's more general. It's almost as if the brands are scared that by talking about complexity and the difficulty of it, that somehow they're going to put off consumers. Whereas actually, I rather think that if you're honest with consumers about what the realities of these things are, you could actually completely shift the dialogue. So instead of it being, well, actually, you can have a complete new outfit for $50. So to say, well, actually, wouldn't you rather spend $100 and have one item where you can tell the story of where it's from, what it does, and all the people its production has helped? And I think that perhaps if we moved again to loop back to things like the Delta framework, something that allowed a more three-dimensional way of communicating what actually is going on, then it would be possible to actually tell the story. So it might be possible for a brand to be able to say, well, actually, we didn't do so well on perhaps environmental input performance this past year, but look what we've done around, working on incomes for, say, cotton farmers, whatever it might be, and to be able to place that within a bigger wheel. You actually start to make a much more intelligent discussion. And then to come back to Chris's point, which is, could the Delta framework be applied to viscose? I think the Delta framework, or something like it, could and should be applied across the whole of the sustainability space, because what it tries to do is
fibers. I think the land-based fibers, that's not going to be an issue. So we're looking at it on our animal fibers as well as viscose. So I would say just stay tuned. That's happening in the discussions, no doubt about it. And that helps with chain of custody and what's going on. The other thing you mentioned about consumer-facing label, we're working on a project now with Responsible Business Consortium. And it is taking that label for consumers to say, okay, and one of the things consumers care about is animal welfare. And so it is about what are the things they're caring about. They care about chemistry and chemicals. And so it is about fiber materials, like, and putting that on a label. So that project is called Impact Index. There'll be more coming on that as well. But I think that there's more innovation and more opportunities. And you have to have that critical mass before you're ready to have that common language to talk to consumers. So the time, I think, is now. There's some lovely pilots coming down the pike for 2022. And so it'd be great if people are interested, they could let Rose know that they're interested in being part of those conversations. But there's some things bubbling up, which is good.
Yes, and we've also been talking to basing on our research on smallholder farming last year, we're looking at whether we could establish some analogous structure to the Delta framework, looking at smallholders.
Well, participate in that. It's in fact, there's several a lot of piloting was done in India this year, as well as we did it in several other countries in organic. So there's lots of data coming in on the Delta framework for year 2 of the pilot. So we expect to roll that out more robustly. And ISEAL is doing that, Better Cotton Initiative, Cotton Connect, US Cotton Trust Protocol, we're involved in it. So we're getting more and more critical mass on the use of the Delta framework. And like I said, we'll be looking at an adaptation of that, of what does it take to add animal fibers, grazing, and things into that, because the principles are the same. And so it's about not reinventing the wheel, but building. And I think that's another thing we need to talk about in the collaboration, is that we don't need to set up additional duplicative initiatives. We need to build, we have proven solutions. It's about scaling those up. So let's invest in what we already have on the grid to build those to scale and deliver on the proven solutions. We have a short time frame. And so it's not about inventing new things. It's about leveraging what we have.
Yeah, I think that then there's a question here from Anonymous. Traceability is a key point.
Mhm.
Don't you think we need to try and reduce effort and cost for traceability to make it popular? Yes, that's right. I mean, and if everyone decides they're going to invent their own traceability structure, then yes, it will be expensive and complicated, but it's already been done, chaps. Like wheels, it doesn't need to be done again. Fine. An approach,
Get with
for
a
example,
program.
yeah,
And once you get to critical
an approach
mass,
like an
yeah.
approach like Cotton Connect or US Trust Protocol would have to be adapted for other spaces. But the fact is, the basic logic of what you're trying to do, that knowledge is out there. Let's use that more widely.
Yeah, and we have just launched. In fact, we have 80%. We have over 40,000 sites certified to our standards. We've launched, all of our standards have chain of custody. They're built upon that. And it is about amortizing. So, while it may have cost several $millions to build this program, we've made it open and accessible to other smaller standards. So they don't have to have, you can amortize and have just, if they're only using this many bits of that, then they can have access to that. So we have a very robust system for our standards and welcome other smaller standards to be able to utilize that chain of custody system. So at that point in time, it does become more cost effective because you're able to amortize that across, critical mass. So once you get to that point, instead of it being $1 per whatever, it can be 50 cents and then 10 cents. And so it is about getting to critical mass and having scalable solutions.
I think that's key. Interesting question from Patricia Jurovitz. I'm seeing a bit of a conflict between the US-driven traceability approach and the EU-driven due diligence approach. US brands seem to be only interested in traceability of their products, but not actually implementing risk prevention and mitigation approaches, which are designed to reduce harm. Any suggestions on how to encourage brands to implement due diligence? Can I take a first pitch at this one and then go into it? I'm not sure that there's necessarily that to sort of present it as EU versus US would necessarily be the case, especially as there have actually been, I think in the last Senate, there were similar moves were put forward. They didn't make it through because the Senate ended before the elections. So this has also, the idea of mandatory due diligence has been talked about in the US, and of course, Dodd-Frank, which looked more broadly at supply chains, was obviously an American piece of legislation. And also, I think there are risks around what the EU is doing in terms of due diligence, because the obvious risk is that, and I'm looking at it particularly in relation to smallholder farming, that if you're saying you need to be able to demonstrate no harm, as it were, well, actually what you'll do is you'll go and buy from the sort of massive companies that use very large scale farming, where they can demonstrate, they've got the systems to be able to demonstrate good practice, which actually potentially makes the situation for smallholder farmers infinitely worse. And you certainly saw that when the EU introduced last year a ban on the use of palm oil in biofuels. The idea was that palm oil's bad because it led to deforestation. Well, sorry, chaps, that's already happened. That horse has already left the stable. And actually the impact meant that it just means that French sugar beet farmers end up providing biodiesel, whereas Indonesian smallholder farmers have lost out quite badly. So with all of these sort of macro level interventions, there's got to be a balancing point between looking at what the potential negative externalities might be. And so I think that still means that we do, comes back to our main point, that we still need to understand the complexity. Yes, due diligence regulation could end up driving, could drive people being much more interested in their supply chains. But if it just defaults to the legal department saying just do the simple thing, then they're not necessarily going to move the agenda forward. Rhea, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, we're working with both US and European brands, Japanese brands, and traceability is a tool. Traceability to what? And so it is about what is the source, what is the country of origin, what type of farms? Is it small scale, scale farmers, as in a lot of instances in different regions, or is it the large scale commercial farms? Is it, what kind of social practices? So the traceability is only a tool. So in a lot of our member brands that are looking for traceability, demanding traceability, it's so that they can have that information on what impacts are we delivering? What investments do we need to make in order to to drive positive impacts. And so the traceability isn't an end to itself. Like I can see where it's coming from. That is only the beginning of the journey. Okay, now that I have traceability, which is different than transparency, those are nuanced, then that at that point in time, they can really start looking at what are the pros and cons of sourcing from this region and area? Are there ways that we can improvement? Are there interventions that we can take to drive positive impacts? And so I think there is a demand for traceability. It's huge, but it is only a tool and to really have more engagement in that supply network.
Yeah, I think that's right. But again, I think it needs to be a balance between these use of these different tools. And I think that due diligence regulations can be very helpful, but there is a risk that they backfire as well. And again, as one of the questioners was saying, that traceability is a good thing, but if everyone does it in their own way, then you end up with a structure that becomes far too complicated, far too expensive to make it worthwhile. So I think again, it comes back to what we've been saying before about the need for collaboration.
Yep.
Right. How are we doing on answering our questions?
There's one on price from Anonymous of like, it's also concerns about the availability. Well, at some point in time, it is about sending a clear market message. The people that have been willing to expect, to do speculative farming, so to speak, of like, I'll go ahead and grow this organic cotton on a maybe, or I'll do this organic linen or responsible wool. The people that have the ability to speculate have been speculating, and that's what's been building the market. At the same time, it's one of those things where you have to be able to have a plan. And so this is putting a lot more pressure on brands and retailers to have a plan, to send clear market messages of, I plan on using 1,000 bales of organic cotton over, a period of time. So it is a that willingness to send a clear market message so that availability will be there. There's also a barrier to growth right now for organic cotton specifically, simply because there's a 3-year in conversion transition time. So it is also about going to, we've got strong organic brands, a number of them that now have a transition program, an in conversion program. They're not going to have more organic. We're not going to have more without supporting the years of change. So what does it look like to have a product group or a blending program or something like that supports the years of change? So we're certainly working with the marketplace to support the years of change. There's an on-ramp. What does it look like to help support that on-ramp? We've got another great program, impact incentives, that we're looking at of like, how do we get people to start those best practices before they're able to meet a standard? What does that on-ramp look like before you're able to get into responsible wool or responsible down? What investments need to get there? But then there's not going to be more preferred fiber without clear market signals. So we've got, as a mission-based organization, one of my big jobs for next year is more missionary work and working with, literally going to be calling, if you're one of our members in a brand, you will be getting a phone call to say, show me your fiber strategy and what is going on. Are you sending clear market messages? Because we've set a goal together, you bought into it, to get to 45, and to get to 45, preferred fibers is one of the solid paths and proven solutions. And so it's these, you need to go beyond that token program, that capsule collection. We need to have a corporate solution across your entire use of materials. So it is going to be about clear market messages and willing to escape from the price paradigm to a value paradigm. It's going to be a huge step and a mindset shift for the industry to make this happen.
And that brings us quite nicely around to the other unanswered question as yet from Jonathan Rivin, with regard to communicating with consumers. Buyers have environmental product declarations being considered in addition to eco levels. And I think there you kind of get into, and again, this is something we talk about in the report, the need to, I suppose, educate consumers. The evidence at the moment is quite clear that most consumers, people like us read these things as long as we've got our reading glasses, just because we do, but most people don't. And the evidence is that most consumers are confused, don't really understand the claims being made on various sustainability labeling, and or they just presume that it's already factored into what they're buying. And certainly if you look at things like coffee, there's a presumption that, well, of course it's sustainably produced, whether or not it actually is. And certainly if you were to ask Joe Public, the difference between different eco labels. They simply wouldn't know. So whilst environmental product declarations might be jolly useful for people like us, the other sort of 99.9% of the consuming public, it really wouldn't necessarily on its own make a difference. And I think this then loops back to what Larry's just been saying, that it requires companies, fairly fundamentally sort of revisiting the discussion they have and changing the paradigm. Rather than it being, yes, you can have 3 t-shirts for $10. Oh no, yes, there's a little label on it that tries to pretend that they've been nicely produced. Actually saying, well, guys, you can't have 3 t-shirts for $10 and expect them to be produced with no environmental degradation, with human rights adhered to all the way along the chain. There needs to be that fundamental shift and an education of consumers. And this is not because consumers are stupid, quite the contrary. But at the end of the day, they don't want to spend their entire shopping trip reading a pile of labels. There's got to be a reinvention of that discussion, and then things like environmental product declarations start to make more sense, because you've got a basis of knowledge and a basis of understanding amongst the consuming public and politicians and journalists that allows a much more intelligent discussion, a much more three-dimensional exploration of the complexity of the thing. And again, looping back to this issue about processes like the Delta framework, a way of actually sort of saying, right, well, let's just take this apart at a time. So Lorraine, do you want to come in on that one?
I think you're right on that there's got to be, it's a layered approach again, that there's a component for government, there's a component for the brand to be establishing, before you can put it on a product, you have to have a corporate strategy around what you're going to do across your products and across your fibers, materials, and mills and everything. So I think the next big step for the industry is to take it from, a micro strategy around a core group of products into a corporate strategy. And then they're able to say, okay, here's our cotton strategy, and here's what we're doing to move cotton to a more sustainable solution, more regenerative practices over time. And then what does that look like on a product by product basis? There's very few companies that are planning out this far and as extensively as they should in order to have this game plan of getting to 45. There's a number of great leaders in the industry, but that next layer of work is really important to do. In the meantime, there are some legislation. There's a product environmental footprint work going on. There's more stuff about LCAs and LCA pluses, which we could go into a lot. But I think greater regulation is coming. The need for companies to have stronger strategies to address this is going to be imperative if they're going to survive and be a part of the solution. So I think that it's a multifaceted. We're going to have to do all that, and the paradigm is huge. So it's going to be interesting, and it's exciting work as well.
Yeah, certainly that. It's certainly that. But as I say, it's about getting to the stage where, coming back to the first of our conclusions, but it's at the moment there's almost a reductio ad absurdum, getting to the stage where people want to be able to pretend, look, this is simple and straightforward, you do just this one thing. You focus on organic cotton, you focus on reforesting in viscose, or reducing the number of standards, that somehow you've solved the problem. Metaphorically, that's a bit like sort of saying you polish the dashboard on your car, therefore everything about that car is perfect. It's simply not the case. But I guess the question is, it's how one can expand that discussion in a way which is measured and manageable. And I guess, and this is the $1 million question, or the multi-billion-dollar question, it is how to engage those bits of business who haven't got sustainability on their business card. It was interesting with the work we did last year on smallholders. We were working with some very big, very, very big, very well-known brands. And it was interesting, talking to people in procurement at some of those big companies, saying, well, yes, I've got in my performance matrix, I've got deliverables to do with sustainability, but as long as I make the cost savings that I mandated, then I'll get my bonus.
It's a contrary dynamic.
Yeah,
I think talking to a lot of the brands, because it's not only it's the social component, it's the environmental component, it's the chemistry component, it's the there's so many things, and it's because it is an all the above strategy. We can't afford just to do one thing at a time. I think brands can get really overwhelmed because many times they only have one point person, one sustainability officer. And so it is about how do they embed that across the organization and to where everybody's helping do that lift. But that comes back to a corporate strategy as well. So I think it's going to be interesting of how we move it out of departments into more holistic strategies and have the torchbearers in those companies be more empowered and have, that strategy embedded across, because I also feel like brands are very overwhelmed by the amount of work that's going to have to be done in a short period of time. And so I think part of our job is how do we say, here's the path, here's the journey, here's some tools, how do we make it be where we're part of the solution as well, in order to give guidance and facilitate and build the bridges. And you shouldn't have to build that bridge already. Other people are building that bridge. It's a matter of, preparing for and taking the journey.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's this is why I've sometimes felt that occasionally the approach that NGOs take, or some NGOs take, about sort of pointing the finger, but then when being asked for help in finding an answer, they sort of say, not my problem, Gov.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just going to criticize.
Yeah,
I'm going to
exactly.
be criticizing. I'm not going to say,
Yeah.
okay, here's some solutions.
Yeah,
I always tell my family and my team members, I'm like, if you have a problem, that's great. You've identified something, but come to me with, here's a challenge, here's an opportunity, and here's some ideas on how I think we can address it.
Yeah.
So I think it's time to stop the criticizing and be part of the solution.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've started with the way we're taking forward our smallholder work is to try and provide a forum for that sharing of experience. I mean, what we did with the smallholder work last year was, come up with what is effectively this is the paradigm of the issues that need to be addressed if we're to create genuinely sustainable smallholder supply chains. And we're now applying that to a number of sort of cases around the world. In fact, what I've been working on today is Cotton Connect in Gujarat, as a way of trying to say, well, okay, let's use that framework as a way of analyzing what is it that, in this case, Cotton Connect have been doing, which is absolutely groundbreaking. Of all the things they've done, which the ones that being most impactful, that then those are lessons that can then be shared within a framework with others.
Exactly.
And I think if we could perhaps develop something, as you are doing in the apparel space as well, it's making sure that there's a kind of sense of, this is the kind of set of stuff that needs to be done. And within that, here's examples that, okay, they'll need to be some
lessons to learn.
Yeah, and there'll need to be some contextual work done to make sure that they're appropriately implemented, but you don't have to start from scratch.
Exactly. No, there's proven solutions out there. I see last questions that we're getting into the top of the hour. So Apparel Alliance consists of Textile Exchange, Sustainable Apparel Coalition, ZDHC, and AII, as well as a host of other fashion conveners that we're working with. So the four of us, though, have developed alignments and MOUs and are doing integration of tools. And so it's really exciting work, again, moving from islands of good into a force for change. We're currently working on a pathway. Some of you may have read World Resource Institute's report on apparel and what we need to do and what are the challenges to get to 45% reduction of greenhouse gases. So again, proven solutions. It's about using them and scaling them. So expect to see in the first of the year a pathway to 45 that our four organizations are currently working on. I've got some deadlines, in fact, by tomorrow night on drafts of this document. So it's really exciting work to really have not just, again, islands of good, but it's connected, aligned strategies. It's about having connected strategies, and it's about leveraging resources, leveraging time. How can we integrate things together and doing that multiplier effect in order to really accelerate the work that we're doing.
Yeah. And I think that, I know we're now sort of less than 2 minutes for the end, and I think that is perhaps as good a point as any to sort of start to round up that the starting point with the Sustainable Apparel Barometer was to sort of cut through the noise and sort of say, well, what does a sustainability strategy, a state-of-the-art sustainability strategy look like? And I think those sort of broadly 5 conclusions sort of encapsulate that. But the key thing is there's expertise out there. There's fine, not all the answers to all the questions, but there's a heck of a lot out there that people can build on. And there's no need to be scared or off put. There are resources that TE and others have, which are very easily accessible. That knowledge is there, and people just need to know it's there and build on it. Yes, it's a complicated journey, and yes, a lot's got to happen in a relatively short time frame, and a lot that's going to run against the way in which things have been done for a while, but it's doable. It just needs people to sort of get behind it.
Exactly. And so I think that I feel hopeful that we can, as an industry, can make a big difference, that it is the time for action. And so that it's time to stop talking about it and create the plan and take action on the plan. So that's our big message for 2022. And we're ready to face it and ready to go and excited about it.
Yeah, and from our side with the Sustainable Apparel Barometer, we're working on how to take it forward next year, whether we
absolutely looking forward to 2022's observations and conversations.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And trying probably to focus down. And so maybe this stuff around, highlighting best practice, potential for collaboration, I think that may be the way to take it. But thank you very much for being involved.
Absolutely.
This year.
Tanya, again, thank you for all the great work Innovation Forum's doing. Rose, thank you for taking such good care of us. I know it's such an hour, so.
Yes, here, Rose. The tech team behind always get forgotten about. So without you, we are just four voices literally in the wilderness. So
you all are wonderful. I want to say thank you to you, Lorraine and Peter, for today. I know this was very valuable to our audience. I'd like to thank you for participating in today's webinar. As a friendly reminder, an email will be sent to all registered participants with a link to today's presentation. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.
And happy Christmas.
Indeed.